Did your birds leave? Have they flown off?
I didn't want to scare anybody. So I put my stump up.
Okay, folks, I have 12 o'clock. I think we can get started. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us for session 7 of the second series of the Refocus and Rebuild webinars focused on helping Virginia businesses reopen in a COVID-19 world. My name is Sandy Ratliff. I am with Virginia Community Capital. If you're not familiar with us, we are a community development financial institution in Virginia focused on lending, investing, and community innovation services. We are happy to partner with Virginia Small Business Development Center Network, GenEdge, University of Virginia's College at Wise, Office of Economic Development, and the Southwest Virginia Alliance for Manufacturing to offer this weekly webinar series. This is a series of 13 weeks that's going to be focused on helping businesses develop a resiliency plan. Each week has a different section of the plan, and our hope is that should another pandemic or crisis come along, that your business will be prepared. Before we get started, I wanted to note that in order to keep the webinar flowing and that we stay within the 1 hour time frame, we have muted everyone. However, we want to hear from you and ask that if you have a question for our presenter today, that you will please post those in the Q&A section, and we will address those at the end of the presentation. Becky, do you want to take over and introduce Sam, or do you want me to continue on?
You can go ahead and continue on, Sandy.
Well, thank you. Today we're happy to have a speaker back with us that's been with us through this entire program, who's going to focus on crisis management and how to develop your team and processes. Today's session will be led by Sam Wolford. He is the Regional Growth Manager and Trade Adjustment Assistance Program Manager with GenEdge. I've had the pleasure of working with Sam for many years, and I can tell you that he's very passionate about helping Virginia businesses, especially in this post-COVID era, to move forward with it and to help them connect to resources. So, Sam, I'm going to turn the program over to you, and thanks again for presenting today.
Thank you, Sandy. And I do appreciate all the effort that's gone into all of these webinars. I'm getting my screen here ready to share and get started with the presentation. And, what I'm talking about today is crisis management and the crisis management team. It's said that Albert Einstein said that in the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity. And I think he probably took that from that Chinese word for crisis that's made up of 2 characters. One of them represents danger. The other one actually represents opportunity. So, what is a crisis? A crisis can be identified as a disruptive event, really, that affects businesses, facilities, people, and it leads really to stoppage of production, stoppage of work. It can halt production and can have really a cascading effect on revenues, on profitability, production schedules, even customer goodwill. Effects that really adversely affect a business. That's what a crisis is. Some worst case scenarios, they can include things like product recalls, stolen data, false accusations, natural disasters, terrorist attacks, and even things like we're going through right now with the global pandemic. Any of these situations, they can prove to be catastrophic or even fatal to many businesses. Preventing the crises that result from an oversight or a poor decision, really, if you don't prevent them, those types of things can really drag your name through the mud, so it can impact your reputation as well. For that reason, it's imperative to really formulate a crisis response strategy that can handle all of those types of crises should the need arise. I was thinking back and I thought about, what's a significant crisis, and back in the 1980s, and I don't know whether you all remember this, but I certainly do. Johnson & Johnson had an issue with Tylenol, where some of their Tylenol had gotten laced with cyanide, and there were 7 deaths related to that. Johnson & Johnson, they acted very quickly to recall all the Tylenol that was in circulation, and they worked with the FDA to create new tamper-proof packaging, and we see a lot of that tamper-proof packaging today pretty much on anything that we ingest. As a result of their quick response, as a result of the way they handled the crisis, even today, 40 years later, over a decade later, over 4 decades later, Johnson & Johnson is still getting good media coverage for that crisis response. And I can give you another more personal example of handling a crisis. As the director for 911 for a number of years, also working very closely in emergency management and directing it, there were a number of crises that come up. And during one particular snowstorm, we had a very serious crisis come up where the snow was very, very wet, so it was bringing trees down, it was bringing electricity down. We were getting a very large number of calls, and then all of a sudden, partway through the event, we lost all communications to one region within the area that we served. And so that was a huge crisis. What we did was we were able to actually pull together a number of resources, focusing on pulling in folks like the Department of Forestry to give us equipment that could actually help us get to a very inaccessible tower location during the middle of a snowstorm, bringing in the radio technicians and being able to get them on site to go to that tower to try to identify what the problem was and get it mitigated, and then bringing together individuals and personnel that, if we weren't able to get the tower or the communications restored as it was, we would have an alternative, a backup. So after many hours of working to get there, when we got there, we found a tower that had about 10 inches of ice on all of its members that was laying on the ground. That tower on the ground was a huge crisis because all of the radio communications for that particular region from the 911 center went through that tower. What we were able to do is we actually stationed an individual on top of that mountain who relayed the radio communications to the responding service providers across that region, so that we could continue to do what 911 does, and that's get help to those who are in need. We did happen to have a crisis management plan in place, and we were able to utilize it and get the right people in the right places to address that crisis fairly quickly. The biggest challenge was accessing the location. So with being able to pull the resources together quickly, it still took us about 6 hours to get it restored. And we had some other methods that we handled the communications in the meantime. But it could have taken us literally 2, 3, 4 days to get that back up and operational. So, that's just a personal example of a crisis that, you really have to work to try to manage those things. So crisis management, it's a series of steps that an organization performs really to deal with a catastrophic event. Crisis disrupts business operations. It threatens to harm people and damages businesses and negatively impacts finances. It can even cause a business to have to shut down. So crisis management planning, it really needs to begin long before any issue arises. It can be tempting to put off the risk management, the crisis management planning, the things that you need to do when things are going well. It's easy just to sit back and say, oh, well, everything's great. But inadequate preparation, it can really have serious operational, legal, public relations, customer relations consequences if you don't get on it and make sure you're prepared. So, it can result in unprepared stakeholders, people who within your organization, whether it's an employee, whether it's a supplier, whether it's a customer, people who make poor decisions. A customer may say, I don't think they can respond to this, so we're going to jump ship. And a lot of that can be handled through communication, and communication is a critical piece of that. Failing to prepare really, it will increase your recovery time from a crisis. So a crisis management plan, disaster recovery, business continuity plans, they're all interrelated, but they have very distinct purposes. The disaster recovery plan, it details the procedures and the steps to recover from a disaster. Basically, this is what we're going to do after the disaster is over to recover. A crisis management plan focuses on the steps that need to be taken while the crisis is occurring. How do we handle the crisis now? And the business continuity plan, it really focuses on ensuring the continuity of mission-critical business operations. Crisis management planning and disaster recovery planning, they're both part of business continuity planning, and you need to make sure that you have those in your business continuity plan. So any disaster or disruptive event really needs a crisis management plan. Those may or may not be large. Those may or may not be influenced by a lot of outside things that may be internal. It may be, losing a key person. It could be a lot of different things, but there's, aspects that need to be thought about when you're looking at developing your crisis management plan. You need to be able to define, what is a crisis to your business, and what are all the different business components that can have individual crises that can cascade throughout your business to create a large scale crisis. What are the elements of a crisis management plan? And then how do you use it? How do you implement it? So let's talk about 6 steps to managing a crisis. First of all, you really need to put together a professional crisis management team. And when I say professional, I mean individuals who have been trained to do the role that you're asking them to do. Your team really needs to include your CEO, your business leader, and other senior executives, department leaders. You really should have legal counsel involved, public relations involved. It's a whole lot easier to slim down your crisis management team later than to try to add people after you've already started or after you've already gotten through a part of it, because then you have to try to keep people, bring people up to speed on what you've already done. And it's just a whole lot easier to start with a big group, and if you need to narrow it down, you can. So the first step toward drafting a response plan really is you got to know what your weak points are. You got to know where your vulnerabilities are. You could hold a company brainstorming session with that crisis team and list anything. And there's a lot of different things it could be, but list anything that could harm your company. By including people across the entirety of the business, you're going to lower the risk of actually missing something that's critical. And most importantly, be willing to be honest and critical of yourself. It's so easy to look at the business and say, oh, everything's good, everything's going well. If you're not able to be honest and critical with yourself, then surely you will wind up missing something, and it could cost you dearly. So draft a crisis management plan. As we said, crisis management should be a core component of your business continuity plan, but it's important that you customize it based on the results of your weaknesses, based upon your weakness assessment. Make sure that you set clear goals and then work backwards to construct the steps in order to meet those goals. In other words, if you see something that's a weakness that could create a crisis or be something that could happen in a crisis, start with that. Start with what your desired results out of that would be, and then work backwards with your people and with your crisis management team to determine what are the steps that we'll need to take in order to make sure we're able to meet those goals. There are some things that your plan should really address. It should address things like internal and external stakeholders. There should be a primary spokesperson for each of the communication channels that you have. You need to have communication infrastructure and redundancies. Decision-making chain of command needs to be clearly identified. You need to have access to emergency funds. You need to develop things like holding statements, and we'll talk a little bit more about holding statements later, and contingency plans. So create a crisis communication plan. What's one of the most important things around that? The most important thing around that is making sure you have the right person as your spokesman. That's not always your CEO. That's not always the head of the company. Sometimes, they may struggle some with those types of things. You may find someone within your organization that really has the talent and can be comfortable with live or on-camera interviews, comfortable putting together written statements. You may have someone in your organization that's really able to connect with all of the stakeholders. And if you do, that may be the person that you want as your spokesperson. Start reputation monitoring as soon as a crisis occurs. And I say start reputation monitoring. This is really about relationship monitoring. Monitor your relationships with your customers, with your community, with the people that are working within your business, with their families. Make sure that you have that communication chain open so that misinformation or wrong information does not get out. And finally, crisis resolution. You need to assign a team that's tasked with identifying the root cause of whatever the crisis is, and then identifying opportunities. And that's particularly focused on internally created crisis. If an externally driven crisis occurs, you may have multiple teams that are involved in responding to and recovering from those crises. Really, leadership, they need to dig beneath the surface to address the underlying policies, changes within the company, within the organization, that can prevent similar crises in the future and develop those plans that will really help you to manage those types of crises that should they occur. So crisis management planning. The crisis management plan, it contains the communications and the decision-making components of your business continuity plan. So like I said, it is a part, it's an integral part. You have to have those pieces. Well thought out and documented crisis management plan, it will facilitate communication between all the stakeholders with considerations around safety, around making sure the people component of it is taken care of as a priority. It also details the steps that need to be taken for the impact assessment, interaction with the media, and actions that need to be taken to really contain the crisis. So you may want to think about linking your crisis management to guiding principles, to organizational traits. Each of your businesses have guiding principles and organizational traits. Some businesses call them their values. And so connecting your crisis management plan to that can ensure that you have continuity across it. A few examples of that may be safety and security, communication excellence, accountability and decisive leadership. Those are things that that definitely, could connect well to a crisis management plan. But we need to make sure that that's clearly understood as a part of your overall organization. Your leadership needs to clearly understand that your crisis management plan ties to the guiding principles and organizational traits that you have. Your employees across the organization, they need to understand how everything ties together and the importance of it. Principles should be linked to your core values as an organization. So let's think about some factors to be considered in a crisis management plan. Things like the crisis management team. It needs to contain many of your senior leadership. It really should contain the leader of your business, as I said. But you want people who have expertise and experience that's needed in order to manage the crisis. The teams really should consist of anyone with specialized knowledge that's useful to combating the impacts of the crisis. You need to have organizational responsibilities of the team. Each member of the team really should be assigned a specific task by defining the functions and the duties and the responsibilities of that individual during the crisis. You should have sub-teams. Sub-teams, they'll function under the overall direction of the main team, but they'll have people with different types of expertise who can handle tasks that are associated with the crisis in their particular area of expertise. You should have an evaluation and a corrections process. So after the conclusion of a crisis, you should go back and evaluate how you did. Take corrective actions towards the things that may have gone wrong, and make sure you keep a list of the things that have gone right so that you can duplicate those. So you'll need a contact list. A contact list, that's really needs to be very, very, complete. It needs to have contacts for all of your external connections as well as your internal connections, customers, suppliers, employees, families, community leaders, the media. Everyone needs to be in that contact list, and it needs to be a part of your crisis management plan. If possible, you should try to put together a command center, a central place that really is designated as a focal point for handling the crisis. Now, everybody may not stay there all the time, but if you have a place where people can come together, a lot of times with that collaboration, you're able to really get unique solutions to some of the problems that you deal with within that crisis. Logistics is another important issue. How are you getting your notifications out? How are you mobilizing and manning the crisis centers? And all of that really needs to be laid out clearly. And public relations is absolutely critical. We'll talk about that more. You'll be tired of hearing me talk about media by the end of this presentation, but bad press is something that no business really can afford to have. So the crisis management plan, it really should have 6 parts, at least these 6 parts. First, there needs to be a policy statement. That policy statement needs to outline the leadership, the structure, all of the ways that you make the decisions to implement the crisis management team and the crisis management process. You need to have that contact list in there. You need to have that organizational structure, notification and activation procedures, response and management activities, all the activities that you may need to be doing as a response and managing the crisis. And then ultimately, there needs to be a recovery process as well that's identified in your crisis management plan. So what about the crisis management team? Whether you're preparing for a plan in case of a crisis, or whether you're already elbow deep in an ongoing crisis, one of the biggest factors that's going to determine your success ultimately is going to be people, right? People are important, and how you form your crisis management team is very important. To form a strong team, it's very important to have the right people in the right places based upon their individual strengths and talents. And that's a key. That's very important. You need to think about, okay, which department heads to make the most sense? Who needs to be a part of that executive team? Who on our board of directors, if you have a board of directors, is the right person? What about communications and marketing? Are they the ones to handle the communications, or do we need to have someone else? Human resources, obviously, is a huge one. That core group, they're going to help analyze the circumstances and determine a plan of action, implement it, and in order ultimately to minimize the damages as a result of a crisis. When building a team, there's a couple of attributes that those individuals really should have, and we'll discuss those a little bit later in the presentation. So leadership and staffing of a crisis management team, it really is a fundamental aspect of everything that we do, is making sure that we have the leadership in place to handle it. There should be an executive sponsor that really sets the goals and the expectations for the team. Then you need a leader who develops and implements, administers, evaluates, and maintains the program, making sure it's in alignment with that sponsor's goals. You also need to oversee the risk, someone to oversee the risk profile, provide adequate support to mitigate anticipated or imminent risk. Your goal really is to return your organization or your business or your company to normalcy as quickly as possible. So even though it may seem a bit counterintuitive, recognizing that an organization is going through a crisis, is actually dealing with a crisis, is one of the most difficult aspects of that crisis management team. Figuring out, okay, are we in crisis or are we not? So that's something that really takes a lot of thought, and it really can help when you go through and you identify your risk and you identify the challenges associated with those risks. Making sure you're very thorough in that process can really help you when you have to make that decision as to whether you are or are not in a crisis. So when selecting team members to lead crisis response, the crisis management team leader really needs to appoint the best qualified person to address the type of event that you're looking at as part of your crisis management plan. That's not always the supervisor. Sometimes that winds up being, someone that's been there for 30 years and seen everything, and they have the experience to deal with the challenges that go with that. So we need to really think about, how are we dealing with, how are we selecting these members of the team? Personnel with position and ability to quickly assess often unknowable situations, who can rapidly initiate actions to separate, protect, and reduce the impacts of a crisis, they are essential to your crisis management team. In other words, people who are problem solvers and who are able to critically think and think quickly about how to solve those problems. Crisis management team, it really is a symbiotic group, and it can unite, it can pull resources, it can engender confidence among one another, they can work together towards common goals if you have the right team members in place. If you know someone is not a team player, if you know someone is challenging to deal with and really doesn't fit well with other individuals or has personal problems with key members of the team, you probably don't want them on your team. So the core crisis management team really consists of a number of different areas, and we've talked about some of those already. So let's talk a little bit about capabilities. What are some of the capabilities that this team really needs to have? They need to have competencies in risk management, being able to look at a risk, being able to identify what the potential outcomes of those risks are, and develop processes to mitigate those risks. They need to have an attitude that really gravitates towards circumstances and consequences versus the disruption itself. And what I mean by that is they need to be able to see what caused the crisis, whether it's an internal crisis or an external crisis. They need to be able to see what that cause was, and they need to be able to see what the effects of that crisis was and separate that from the actual disruption itself so that they can work on, if possible, dealing with the circumstances that may have caused it to prevent it from continuing, or respond to some of the impacts that have happened from the crisis, rather than just focusing on the crisis itself. So a process that allows systematic review of the risk profile for the impacted operations and assets is also a necessity. You really have to have a process that looks at that. The ability to implement ad hoc mitigation until all the assets are really free from the disruptor impacts. So whatever the crisis is, until you have all of your assets, all of the business functions free from the disruptions from those impacts, you're still needing to be able to implement mitigation. So you need to have the ability to do that throughout. And you need to have the capability of precluding risk from and keep them from evolving through complexity and cascading effects. In other words, you need to be able to figure out how to quickly stop them so that they don't continue to grow and add to the effects of the crisis in the end. So the crisis management team, it should create a media relations element. I told you I was going to be talking about this more, but you really need to have a spokesperson that's tasked with developing a relationship with the media, having meetings, having open houses, having luncheons to help them understand the organization's culture, its operations, and its contributions to the community. Your business, your organization is important to your community. Helping the media to understand that will certainly help them to have a better relationship with you. It also provides an opportunity to learn about what their needs are, what they may need in a crisis, and identifies them as a future stakeholder when a crisis does occur. One method that a crisis management team can use to counter crisis hearsay is to immediately develop that holding statement. I mentioned that before. That holding statement is designed to provide a detailed yet concise picture of the situation. Preparing that initial holding statement and updating it as the response to the crisis evolves, it will provide an accurate picture of the aspects and the assets, the impact, the efforts to mitigate the risk, and the plan to share information with the relevant stakeholders, whether that's your internal employees, whether it's the media, whether that's the community at large. It will position you in a place where you have something to start from that is concise, that is very clear, and that you can actually build off of, rather than just having it be ad hoc. So training and exercise, another very important thing that you need to make sure you're doing with the members of your crisis management team. You can have the best crisis management plan in the world, but if your crisis management team does not know how to use it, how to utilize it, when to use it, then it's useless. And I'm not just talking about at a tabletop, sitting down and talking through, okay, if this happens, we're going to do this. If this happens, we're going to do that. I'm talking about doing a full exercise where you go through the process of assuming that this crisis did happen. And then you work with all of your employees throughout the process to determine, okay, what are the impacts of that? What are the effects of that? How are we going to mitigate that? What are the things we can do to make sure that it doesn't continue to happen? How do we get out of this crisis? Training and exercises is a critical piece of making sure that your crisis management team is prepared when that crisis does come. So leadership management must focus like I said, on the circumstances and the consequences. But it also has to continue to monitor the disruption itself. You know, it's real easy to get focused on the disruption. It's hard to transition to the circumstances and the consequence. But if it's an outside initiated or an externally initiated crisis, then that crisis could be changing. For example, you may have a storm that comes that creates a flood. But with that storm, there could be a tornado that comes behind that. If you're not monitoring the disruption itself, then you may miss something that's critical that will lead to challenges and cascading effects through the crisis. So your risk profile, you know, an effective response to crisis and recovery planning, it really will require an increased monitoring of your organization's risk profile. And you need to maintain a balance of that between preemptive, proactive, and reactive efforts. You know, it's great if you can prevent a crisis. That's the preemptive. And there are things that you can do, and that your crisis management plan should look at those and should identify things that can be done now to prevent future crisis. But, you know, that's not the only piece. You've got to be proactive as well. You've got to focus on, okay, how can we proactively respond to this crisis? In other words, not just prevent it, but have the pieces in place so when the crisis happens, that you're able to quickly get those resources in place and respond. And then there's the reactive efforts. So what happens if it's a crisis that we have not been able to anticipate? What do we do? How do we react? And do we have a process in place for unknown crisis? So those are things that you need to think about as a part of your crisis management plan. One of the best ways to prevent a crisis really from occurring is to develop a risk profile that's specific to the organizational assets, anticipating the type of events that may occur, and either plan to prevent or to respond to them. That's those first two, the preemptive and the proactive. Ultimately, most companies wind up dealing with things in a reactive way. So what are some of the key characteristics that individuals who are part of this crisis management team need to have? Well, first of all, they need to be able to perform under pressure. Crisis situations, they push people to their limits, and people who cannot perform under pressure, they may break, and it may impact the entire team, or it may impact your entire business. They need to have strong analytical skills. They need to be able to look at a situation and immediately start problem solving, start thinking critically about, okay, how can we address this? How can we mitigate it? And it will help you come to the best conclusions and the most efficient ways to deal with the crisis. You know, all the team members, they need to be competent in analyzing and solving problems on the fly as they arise, as they come up. And they need to be able to solve those problems on their own without having to go back to the leader of the crisis management team every time and create a bottleneck of response. They need to be able to communicate clearly and effectively. And I can't emphasize this one enough. Communication is absolutely critical to everything. And each team member, they need to know what's going on. They need to be updated, but they also need to be able to effectively communicate that to the individuals that they need to get that information out to, whether it's the employees that work under them, whether it's the employees' family members, the employees that are being impacted family members, whether it's the media that they're having to deal with. They need to be able to communicate effectively. You know, during a crisis, accuracy and speed of communication they're paramount. And the right information being provided to the right stakeholders at the right time, that really can reduce the stresses associated with a crisis and associated with how your people deal with it. You know, the corporate commitment to resolving the crisis and controlling the flow of information is important. It will prevent the rumors and the misinformation and the wrong information from getting out there. It's vital, especially today, with social media, with email, with all the opportunities we have to communicate, that we put in place a good communication plan, and that everyone knows how to communicate effectively. With that in mind, we need to be planning and conducting and controlling the crisis communications, ensuring that our organizations have addressed the communications with everyone, all the stakeholders. The need for these efforts to be effective, it can't be overstated. The media will say something, even if it's wrong. I've always been told that either you tell your own story or somebody's going to tell it for you. And if somebody tells it for you, you're probably not going to like it. And that's certainly the case with the media if you're not, able to get that communication out to them effectively. So another key attribute or ability that your crisis management team members need to have is a collaborative mindset. Collaboration is absolutely critical in solving complex and difficult problems that come up during crisis. We all have our strengths, we all have our weaknesses, we all have our blind spots. If we're able to work together, then we can come up with a plan that provides a best solution. Any team member, regardless of their skills, they'll be working against the team if they can't work with the team. To reach the best results, all the team members really have to be working together, pulling towards that same goal. So achieving, maintaining a successful crisis management team, that really requires diligent monitoring of internal and external climate and culture. It's very important to know the context of your business and be able to create your crisis management team around that. The key to managing risk, it's fully understanding each of the assets' risk profile, understanding what those risks are, what they look like, and how they can impact your business. Continuous improvement. Once a crisis is under control, it's tempting just to move on to the regular everyday business, right? You want to get your business back up, normal operations. But a successful crisis management team, they'll ensure that they immediately reflect on what's happened. They'll be looking for things that have gone wrong. They'll be looking for things that have gone right. They'll perform a formal after-action review. They'll develop corrective actions, implement change management, and reinforce the training that's necessary in order for it to be effective, that really ultimately can provide you with the desired results of your crisis management plan. So what about crisis management in the midst of COVID-19? A fundamental role of crisis management is to exercise as much control as possible over events that unfold, using every tool available to us to bring about a positive outcome. Well, it certainly has felt like we've been out of control, right? The COVID-19 and the global response to it, it's disrupted global markets, businesses, seemingly every single part of our lives. We really don't know what the ultimate impacts are yet because we're still going through it. Life as we know it, it's changing, isn't it? So much is not in our control. It's mind-boggling to try to figure out, what it is that we should do and what we shouldn't do. But maybe these are some things that you should consider related to the COVID-19 crisis and how we're leading through this crisis. How we respond to that crisis, it really says more about who we are and how we lead than it does about the crisis itself. It's probably a good time to begin to consider modifying the more generic crisis management rules to be more specific to the current challenge that we have. A few things that we may want to consider as we reevaluate the crisis management rules are, first, be honest with ourselves and short-circuiting denial. So, whether we like it or whether we don't, we are in the middle of a crisis. And denying that we're in the middle of a crisis isn't going to help us through the crisis. It's only when we admit the circumstances that we're dealing with that we can actually start to address and fix them. Now, we need to face the probabilities and start to try to turn those probabilities in our favor through the actions that you can take, not through ignoring the problem. We need to be careful not to lose our head. Effective leaders, they really know how to stay calm and focused They know how to put down that obsessive contemplation or panic and turn things towards positive actions. With the current pandemic, there's lots of precautions to take and communications that we've had to make. Whether you're running a company, whether it's a college or university, a nonprofit, others are looking to you for how to behave. So are we behaving calm? Are we behaving rationally? Are we tireless in the things that we're doing? Are we crystal clear in our communication? Those are all keys to making sure that we don't lose our head. We need to do everything that we possibly can do to guard against the bad effects. And then once you've done that, stop worrying about it. Once you've done all that you can, when there is something else to do, jump on it. Do it immediately. But stop worrying about it. So we need to stay flexible and innovate. Flexibility and innovation is a very important factor in success of businesses. Just as the virus as morphs and adapts, you can too. Having grit, resilience, adaptability, out-of-the-box thinking, those are all things that we've talked about over the past decade, time and time again. So let's take this opportunity now to actually live them. Given that most of us are far closer to home for far longer than we've ever been before, we're going to be using our ingenuity to work better. And we have. We've had to work remotely. We've had to fight things like social isolation and engage with one another in unique and interesting ways. But we'll need all of our grit really to take care of ourselves and to take care of one another. And that leads to creating your virtual command center now. Do you have something set up, a war room, where your crisis management team can really get together, whether it's virtually or whether it's in a real place, and meticulously plan and organize the crisis response? It's time to dust off all your generic old crisis plans and tailor them to today's situations. Plan for every kind of contingency that you can think of related to this COVID-19. We need to communicate clearly and kindly. And I've talked about communicating clearly and the importance of communicating clearly. I want to focus on kindly now. We live in a world that is very divided. And there's a lot of things that create that division. Our communications should not be one of those things. We should learn to communicate kindly, communicate in kindness. It doesn't mean that we necessarily have to agree with things that we don't agree with, but it means that we can say things in a way that aren't offensive, that defuse situations rather than incite them. Become the trusted source of information through the crisis. This is truly an opportunity. There's so much misinformation out there. There's so much that we don't know. And it's okay to say that we don't know it. But with the information that we do know, where our expertise are, we need to do all we can to make sure we get the right information out to the right people at the right times. We live in a world where television really feels real, doesn't it? Any story that's shown on the big screens in our living room, they can seem closer to us than the faraway reality. So the truth, it's bound to get muddled. We need to not make sure that we're not being a part of that. If organizations or businesses can come to the trusted voices in their field, go to resources for solid information, they'll be doing a service to themselves as well as the people, the customers, the community that they're in. I would predict that those businesses that are making sure that the information they're passing through is correct, I would predict that they'll be able to recover and maintain a stronger reputation much longer than those who stay silent or go to extremes. So think outside of yourself and your immediate tribe. It's time really that we think about breaking the me first reflex. During the plague, really, around the Spanish flu and the other things the other plagues that have happened, they haven't been characterized by selflessness or compassion When individuals' very existence was threatened, they tend to turn more inward, more tribal, less compassionate. If you can, perhaps it's time to really break that me first reflex. Consider more humanitarian actions, even when it may be to your disadvantage. Think about how you can help others, even if maybe it's not helping you. Now, I'm not suggesting that you don't take care of yourself or your family. I'm just suggesting that you radically expand your definition of what family is. When we went through September 11th, 2001, that very evil act, it created a bond. It created a unity across our nation that we didn't have for many years, and that we're beginning to lose. Maybe this pandemic may be an opportunity for us to regain some of that. So let's go back. In the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity. What are the opportunities? The opportunities are for us to create a crisis management plan that actually will prepare us for the crisis when they occur, help us to recover more quickly, help us get back to normalcy. It will also help us to identify individuals within our businesses, organizations that have talents, that have abilities that we can utilize, not just during the crisis, but all the time. When you can't control what's happening, challenge yourself to control the way you respond. That's really where our power is. So a crisis management plan is just a plan for us to control the way we respond. So if there's any questions, I'll be glad to answer any. Here's my contact information.
Well, thanks, Sam. Another stellar job. Again, I don't expect anything less from you. Thank you so much. Just as you were presenting, I was thinking of just some things that have happened in this part of Virginia, like the tornado that happened and impacted, the Glade Spring and Washington County area. We've had a number of snowstorms that has demolished roofs of existing businesses. And then I think we can all learn from our neighbors in Sparta, North Carolina, what happened to them about a month ago when the earthquake. All of these things are things that you cannot predict. And that's why, a business owner, organization, or leader should not go back, well, it's not going to happen to me. You have no way of knowing it. If you do know that, then I want to know your lottery numbers, or I want to go to Vegas with you because you must know something that I do not know. But that's something to think about. We do have a couple of questions. One is, how do you handle pushback within your company to creating such a crisis plan? For example, what if some management members think it's just more policies, or they don't want to listen to all the levels employee input and all the levels of employee input in the crisis management? Or number two, what if employees think it's just another new policy that will be put on the shelf one day?
I think what you're talking about there is getting that leadership buy-in. And getting leadership buy-in really has a lot to do with them understanding how it's impacting the business as a whole, or how it has the potential to impact the business as a whole. So the more that you can push things down to the financial side, the better reaction you're going to get from your leadership within your company or your organization. I think that, just looking at the sheer numbers of businesses, 65% of all businesses that experience a major disaster fail. That's a FEMA statistic that came from them. That's huge. Any business is subject to failing then, not just those who are, small, or those who have, a small footprint. Any business is subject to fail. So what I would suggest that you do is try to find a way to relate it to the financial side, to the survivability of the business. And ultimately, once you do that, once you have that leadership buy-in, that leadership can help you in getting the employee buy-in as well, helping them to understand that the role that they play within the business really is critical to that business and has an impact on that bottom line and impacts ultimately their paycheck. And by it impacting their paycheck, they should care whether or not that company is able to respond or recover from a crisis and how quickly that happens. Would they rather be laid off for 6 weeks or be able to go back to work within the week, being a part of responding to that crisis and recovering from it?
Well, Sam, something else that I was thinking about, and partners, if you have any questions, please chime in. But, let's say that I do develop my resiliency plan and I've got a team within the organization. Everybody's got their parts to play, but, you get busy. A month passes, 6 months passes, but how often do you think as a leader that you should go and reevaluate that resiliency plan? Because I can think about people come and go at organizations, and you may had someone that they were going to be the point person for media. How often do you think to have a viable and working resiliency plan that should be revisited and updated or refreshed?
That's why I think it's one of the most critical pieces of that crisis management plan is the crisis management team leader. That should become a part of their regular job. They should be thinking about that on, at least a monthly basis. Maybe not revisiting it, but thinking about it, thinking about what changes may have occurred. If you can get the right ownership of that crisis management plan, then that individual can help make sure that it is revisited on a regular basis. I would suggest at least revisiting the risk assessment side at least every 6 months. That is a critical piece that can help you to identify. And if you're doing that, then obviously you may very well identify some risk that you need to go back and make changes to your crisis management plan. And that will prompt you to bring the whole thing forward and really start thinking about, okay, how do we review it and renew it?
One thing that I've thought about during all this, those of us that work with large state agencies have continuous training that goes on annually. But I think that a plan like this is something that, if they could produce some type of video series where it becomes part of new employee or ongoing employee training, I think that then as you have turnover, that you're less likely to lose that institutional knowledge of that plan.
And then, Cindy, if you go to the other side, if you are only a 2-person business, what kind of recommendation would you have for developing a crisis with, again, a very, very small business? Because on our calls, we have various sizes. So you can have most people, I would say, on the call that's been participating in this are thinking about the big businesses, the 500,000 employees, but a 2-person shop should also be considering this.
That's true. And I think that's where there is an opportunity for your smaller businesses to work with partners like us, in developing that. Because I realize that a lot of times with small businesses, they aren't used to thinking on a corporate scale and even knowing where to start. However, I think a lot of small businesses have found themselves in the position during this time of being hit with not being able to get merchandise or, not having those walk-in customers. And so therefore, how do I keep my business operating? How do I have revenues coming in? And I just don't have the clients walking in that are buying my products. And that's where I think that, for them to turn to partners like us who are working with those smaller businesses and helping them, trying to establish that continuity particularly in sales and marketing to help them keep going is important.
And that also makes me think of next week's, and talking about a small business, next week, we're going to be concentrating on developing a succession plan. And that's one area that small businesses fail to do. So if you're watching or you know somebody, please have them join us next week, because John Martin with Penn Stewart is going to be talking about succession planning. And I've just been with several here lately that's very important. But also that's one way to grow your business, is looking at it. Either you can get your employees involved, just whatever. But I want to put a plug in, because that goes right into what you're talking about, your crisis managers. That's part of it, is if something should happen to the owner, that there's a plan in place should something happen and you're not caught off guard. But any other questions from my partners? Mandy's too involved. Today's her birthday, everyone. So she's in a great mood today. So if you want something from her, today's the day to ask.
Yeah. I was just going to say, great job, Sam. Thank you for the insight again.
Yes, thanks, Sam, so much for sharing your expertise and always being there for this team and doing a super job. Now, we will send out a copy of Sam's slides, as well as this session is being recorded. So we'll send you the link with that. It's something that you should keep as a resource. And don't forget that on all the emails you've been receiving on this session or in this series, I put a link to where you can get a template of a resiliency plan and a guidebook. So there's no reason why you say, well, I don't know where to start. Well, we're giving that to you every time you get an email from me about this. You see it there. Again, don't forget next week's, it'll be session 8. And again, John Martin with Penn Stewart will lead that. And thanks again for everybody for attending. I know everybody is swamped, but I applaud you for your commitment to your organization and to taking the time, because that's the key, is doing the work now and you're not panicked should they. Look at our friends in Florida and Alabama and so forth, what they're getting ready to happen, and how many of those folks are not prepared for a crisis should it happen. So thanks again, everybody. Be safe. Carrie, if you're in Southwest Virginia, be sure you don't leave without your umbrella. And Sandy, you had a question.
I had one more comment just to make. If there are businesses out there who are still finding themselves in a need for some grant funds, I would ask that you perk up your ears and be listening over the next 3 to 4 days, because there is some new exciting information coming out about some grant opportunities. The SBDC state office will be offering a webinar next week with some more information. I know that our office today has begun to queue up some emails, and we'll be sending out something in the next several days, which will give information about registration for a webinar to give you more information on some additional grant funding. So just wanted to put that out there. We're kind of under a gag order right now, so we can't give out any more information, but do just have your ears open for some new things coming out in the next 3 to 4 days.
Great. And Cindy, you did great as a ventriloquist, because you were talking, I didn't even see your mouth moving because your video was froze. So great job. But thanks again, Sam. Thanks everybody for joining us. And I hope to see you next week, and keep moving forward. Thanks everybody.